The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling gold and amber across the wide, rolling fields of the Marlowe Ranch. A thin mist hovered low over the grass, curling like ghostly fingers around the fence posts. The air smelled faintly of dust and dry hay, carried on a wind that whispered to the brittle stalks. It was a beautiful sight, but Clara Marlowe barely noticed. Her boots sank into the damp earth as she trudged toward the barn, the same barn her father had once kept in perfect order. Now, the door sagged on rusty hinges, and would groan under the weight of years without proper repairs. Inside, the smell of animals and old would hit her, familiar, but tinged with something sharper, the scent of desperation. She counted the feed sacks, noting with a sinking heart that there were only 3 left. The bills sat in a neat stack on the small desk by the barn wall, each envelope an unopened threat she was too afraid to read. She already knew what they said. Payment overdue. Final notice. Immediate action required. Her father's death had left her with not just grief, but a mountain of debts she could barely climb over. Clara had been fighting to keep the ranch alive for nearly a year now. She worked sunrise to sundown, patched fences, sold off cattle, and even took in sewing work for neighbors in town. But no matter how hard she worked, the debts kept growing, like weeds that couldn't be cut down. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders ached every night, and still the fear gnawed at her that one day soon someone would come and take it all away. That morning, she was mending a broken water trough when she heard it, the faint but unmistakable rhythm of hooves against the hard-packed dirt road. She paused, leaning on the handle of her hammer, her heartbeat quickening. The sound grew louder, steadier, like a drumbeat announcing bad news. From the barn door, she squinted into the rising sun and saw a lone rider approaching. At first, the figure was little more than a dark silhouette against the light. He rode with an easy, practiced posture, the kind of man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than on solid ground. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. A weathered hat pulled low over his brow, a long duster coat trailing behind him, the leather reins held in one gloved hand. His horse was a large, muscular bay, its coat gleaming with sweat and morning light. Clara's stomach tightened. She had seen men like this before, collectors, hired hands of banks, strangers who brought bad news in official envelopes. She set the hammer down and wiped her hands on her skirt, steeling herself. Whatever he wanted, she would not show fear. The rider slowed his horse as he reached the front yard, dust swirling around the animal's hooves. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion and tipped his hat in a manner that was polite but distant. His eyes were sharp, a deep brown that seemed to take in every detail of her and the ranch in one glance. Clara Marlowe? His voice was low, calm, but carried the authority of someone who rarely had to repeat himself. "That's right," she said, her chin lifting just a little. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, sealed and stamped. "I've been sent by my employer to deliver this." Clara took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. She could guess its contents. "And who exactly is your employer?" she asked. "Mr. Alden Reeve," the man replied, "owner of the Reeve Cattle Company. According to the records, this property and its assets now belong to him." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She broke the seal, her eyes darting over the formal, unforgiving language of legal ownership transfer. There it was in black and white. Her father's ranch, her home, the land she had bled for, signed away because of debts she couldn't pay. She looked back at the man, who stood silently, waiting. "And you are?" she asked, her voice tight. "Ethan Cole," he said simply, "Mr. Reeve's representative. My orders are to see this property vacated within the week." Clara's fingers clenched around the paper until it crumpled. "Then you can ride back and tell Mr. Reeve he'll have to tear this place from my hands. I'm not leaving." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Ma'am, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to inform." "Well, I'm informing you right back," she snapped. "This ranch is mine. My father built it with his own hands, and I'll die before I walk away from it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the morning wind stirring between them. Ethan studied her with a look that was unreadable, somewhere between pity and something sharper, like interest. Then he tipped his hat again. "You got 6 days," he said. turning toward his horse. "I'll be back." Clara watched him mount up, the leather creaking under his weight. He gave the horse a light nudge, and the animal trotted back down the road, dust trailing behind. She stayed where she was until he disappeared over the rise, her jaw clenched, her pulse still pounding. When the sound of hooves was gone, she crumpled the papers in her hands and tossed them into the dirt. The sun was fully risen now, bathing the ranch in warm light, but it brought her no comfort. Instead, it only seemed to reveal every flaw, every broken fence and empty pasture, every reminder how close she was to losing everything. She bent to pick up the papers again, smoothing them out just enough to read the fine print. She didn't have the money, and there was no miracle coming to save her. But she wasn't about to let some stranger, or his employer, decide the fate of her home. As she walked back toward the barn, Clara knew one thing for certain. Whatever it took, whatever she had to risk, she was going to fight for the Marlowe Ranch. The morning after their tense encounter, the air between Clara and Ethan was still sharp, like the desert wind before a storm. Ethan had tethered his horse near the corral, saddlebags packed but untouched. He wasn't in a hurry to push her off the land, at least not yet. His mission was simple: ride into Dustwater, hand over the repossession notice, and make sure the bank's claim was enforced. He'd done jobs like this before. Take the money, move on, no questions asked. But there was something about the defiant fire in Clara's eyes that unsettled him. As he saddled up for town, Ethan's mind wandered to the road that had brought him here, months of drifting from one small job to the next, always keeping his heart locked behind the walls built after the war. He told himself he wasn't cruel, only practical. Men like him didn't have the luxury of sentiment. But the image of Clara standing on her porch in yesterday's sunrise, chin lifted like she could stare down a mountain, kept creeping into his thoughts. Clara wasn't one to wait around. She rode into town a short while after him, dust trailing behind her in the golden light. Every mile closer to Dustwater tightened her chest. She hated this place now. It wasn't always like this. She'd grown up coming to town for Sunday fairs and market days, her father's warm hand on her shoulder. Now, the same faces she once knew greeted her with sidelong glances, whispers behind gloved hands. She'd become the girl who couldn't pay her debts, the rancher's daughter who'd failed. When Clara reached the bank, Ethan was already inside, speaking in low tones to Mr. Hargrave, the manager, a sharp-faced man with eyes like a vulture's. Clara pushed the door open, ignoring the stares from the two women, arranging ledgers near the counter. "This is a mistake," she said loudly enough for the room to hear. "My father's land is ours. You can't just—" Hargrave didn't even blink. "The debt's unpaid, Miss Thompson. It's been months. We've given you every courtesy." His tone was flat, rehearsed, the same one he used to swat away any plea. "Mr. Cole here is doing his job. Your anger would be better spent at your own ledger." Clara felt the heat rise in her face as a couple of townsfolk pretended to browse the bank's bulletin board while listening intently. She hated the way they looked at her, like she was already gone, like she was a tragic story they'd gossip about over supper. She drew herself taller, even though her insides twisted. "My father worked this land his whole life. I'm not giving it up because you want to line your pockets." Ethan shifted, catching Hargrave's smirk out of the corner of his eye. Something about the man's smug certainty made his stomach knot. He'd seen Clara walk into the bank like she was marching into a fight she knew she couldn't win, and it stirred something uncomfortable in him. He didn't owe her anything, and yet he found himself speaking. Maybe she deserves a chance to make it right. Hargrave's brow lifted. "You're not paid to negotiate, Cole." His voice carried the subtle warning of a man who held all the cards. Ethan met his gaze evenly, but didn't answer. Clara's heart was still hammering when she stepped outside into the sunlight, refusing to let anyone see her cry. Ethan followed a moment later, his boots slow on the wooden steps. "You got fight, I'll give you that," he said, almost reluctantly. "I don't need your approval," she snapped, turning toward her horse. But she paused when he spoke again. "I'll give you a week," Ethan said, surprising even himself. 7 days. Find a way to pay them off. Make an offer, whatever you can. After that, he didn't finish, because he wasn't sure what he'd do after that. Clara turned to face him, suspicion and hope warring in her expression. Why? Ethan shrugged, tugging his hat lower against the sun. Call professional courtesy. Or maybe I'm curious to see if you can actually pull it off. She narrowed her eyes. You'll regret giving me time. Ethan almost smiled. Maybe. They mounted their horses in silence, riding separate paths back toward the edge of the desert. But the words hung between them like an unspoken challenge, one neither of them intended to lose. The sun climbed lazily over the horizon, casting a golden light across the parched fields of Clara's ranch. The wind was dry, carrying the faint smell of dust and hay. Clara stepped out onto the porch with her coffee cup, surveying the land her father had worked so hard to keep. But now it looked tired, as if it had taken on her own exhaustion. A few of the cattle were grazing far out, ribs faintly visible, and one fence post leaned crookedly, threatening to collapse entirely. She set her jaw. She wouldn't let this place fall apart, not while she still had strength in her bones. Her day started the way most did, tending to the animals, checking the feed, and trying to stretch what little supplies she had left. But the reality was grim. 2 of the calves looked sickly, and no amount of care seemed to bring them back to health. She wiped her brow, the sun already hot despite the early hour. In her heart, she knew she couldn't afford a vet, not when the bank was already circling like vultures. Ethan appeared near the barn, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. He leaned on the post with a casual air, watching her struggle with a stubborn latch on the feed room door. "Need a hand?" he called, his voice carrying that infuriating mix of politeness and teasing. Clara bit back her usual retort. "I'm fine," she said, though the truth was she wasn't. The door finally gave way with a loud creak, nearly toppling her. Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing, just gave a faint smirk. Despite his role as a man sent to take her ranch, Ethan had a habit of showing up where she least expected. By mid-morning, she caught him repairing the fence line, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. "Don't think this means I'm helping you keep the place," he muttered when she approached. "Just making sure when I take it, it's not falling apart." Clara gave him a look that could have curdled milk. But deep down, she noted the way he worked, quick, efficient, and without complaint. Over the next few days, an odd rhythm began to form. Clara would be out with the herd, and Ethan would be fixing something that had been broken for weeks. He cleared a clogged water trough, mended the barn roof, and even helped coax a lame horse into the shade. "You don't have to do this," she told him one evening as they both leaned against the corral fence, watching the sun dip low. "Maybe I do," he replied quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence between them wasn't entirely uncomfortable anymore. Clara found herself catching glimpses of something softer in him, a quiet patience, a way of listening without interrupting. Once, while passing her the feed bucket, his fingers brushed hers, and for a split second, she felt an unexpected jolt. She quickly busied herself with the chickens, pretending not to notice. Late one afternoon, as clouds began to gather, Clara glanced up from the barn and felt her chest tighten. The sky to the west was darkening fast, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain. "Storm's coming," Ethan called from the pasture, his voice sharper than usual. Together, they hurried to secure the animals. Clara chased the stubborn calf into pen, while Ethan reinforced the barn doors. Lightning cracked in the distance, making the horses skittish. By the time they got everything tied down, the first drops were already pelting the dust. The air grew heavy, and the rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. Clara stood at the barn entrance, breathing hard, her hair plastered to her forehead. Ethan came up beside her, rain dripping from his hat brim. For a moment, they just looked out at the dark horizon, neither speaking. The storm was here, and it was going to be a long night. The wind howled across the plains like a beast awakened, bending the tall prairie grass until it nearly kissed the mud. Clara tightened the latch on the chicken coop, her hair whipping into her face as the first drops of icy rain splattered against her cheeks. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, turning the evening sky into a churning wall of gray. She glanced toward the open pasture, where cattle were already stirring nervously. A storm like this could break fences, scatter livestock, and undo weeks of hard work, and she couldn't afford another loss. Ethan emerged from the barn, a length of rope slung over his shoulder, his shirt already soaked through. "Fence near the north pasture's leaning," he called over the roar of the wind. "If it goes, half your herd will be halfway to the county line before morning." His voice carried urgency, but his eyes, calm and steady, met hers for a moment longer than necessary. Clara nodded, grabbing her gloves and coat. This wasn't the time for stubborn pride. They needed every able hand. They reached the pasture just as the rain turned into a driving sheet, soaking them to the bone. Lightning split the sky in blinding flashes, illuminating Ethan as he braced himself against the gusts, hammer in one hand, holding the fence post steady with the other. Clara fought to keep her balance in the mud, passing him nails and pulling the fence wire taut. Every roll of thunder seemed to shake the ground beneath their boots. Suddenly, a deafening crack rang out. One of the gates at the far end of the pasture had blown free, swinging wildly on its hinges. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Keep this side steady, I'll get the gate." But as he sprinted through the mud, a loose plank caught his boot, and he stumbled, twisting his ankle hard. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She ran after him, grabbing his arm before he could push himself up again. His face was pale, jaw tight with pain. "You're hurt," she said, half shouting to be heard over the storm. "It's nothing," he muttered, trying to wave her off. "Just get that gate closed before the cattle bolt." Together, they fought the wind, dragging the heavy gate back into place. Clara used every ounce of her strength to hold it steady, while Ethan drove the latch home with his hammer. By the time the gate was secure, their hands were raw, their breath coming in short bursts. Clara could feel the rain running down her spine, soaking her all the way to her boots. Back in the barn, the world outside rattled with rain and wind, but the heavy wooden doors gave them shelter. Ethan lowered himself onto an overturned crate, wincing as he examined his ankle. Clara fetched a clean rag and a tin of salve from the supply shelf. Without a word, she knelt in front of him, gently removing his boot. His skin was cold, his socks soaked through. She worked carefully, wrapping the ankle in a rag and rubbing the salve into the scrapes along his leg. "You don't have to fuss over me," he said softly, his usual rough tone tempered with something warmer. Clara glanced up, catching his gaze. "You helped me save my father's ranch tonight," she replied. "Least I can do is make sure you can walk in the morning." The silence between them shifted, no longer heavy with mistrust, but laced with something unspoken. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the bar it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Ethan leaned back against the wall, watching her hands move with quiet concentration. In the dim lantern light, Clara noticed a faint scar along his jaw, the tired lines around his eyes. He broke the silence first. Wasn't always a ranch hand or a debt collector. His voice was low, hesitant. Used to work cattle drives, then odd jobs. But there's no loyalty in that kind of life. Folks pay you, then forget your name the minute the job's done. Clara paused, sensing that he didn't often share pieces of his past. "Sounds lonely." He shrugged. "You get used to it." Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "But seeing you fight for this place, for something that matters, it makes me wonder if I ever stopped long enough to fight for anything of my own." For a moment, Clara didn't know what to say. She had thought of Ethan as a man with a clear purpose, to take what wasn't his and deliver it to someone else. But now she saw cracks in that armor, a hint of someone who might be as rootless as the wind outside. The barn shuddered under a powerful gust, drawing them back to present. Clara pulled an extra blanket from the tack room and draped it over his shoulders. "Storm's not letting up," she said. "Might as well stay here tonight. It's warmer than the house, and I can keep an eye on that ankle." Ethan chuckled quietly. "Guess I'm under house arrest." They shared a small smile, the kind that made the chaos outside fade just a little. Clara leaned back against a bale of hay, exhaustion settling into her bones. The rain pounded on the roof like a steady drumbeat, and the smell of wet earth and hay filled the air. For the first time since Ethan had arrived, Clara didn't feel entirely alone. Yet as she drifted into a light doze, she didn't see the shadow that crossed Ethan's face. He was thinking about the letter he'd received that morning, his employer demanding that he finish the job or lose his pay entirely. It was a threat he couldn't ignore. The storm might have kept the world at bay for tonight, but when the skies cleared, the fight over the ranch would be far from over. The evening was colder than usual, a biting wind curling through the gaps in the old ranch house's walls. Clara set another log on the fire, the crackling warmth filling the room. Ethan sat in the worn armchair opposite her, his hat resting on the table between them, his eyes fixed on the flames. They had spent the day repairing the broken north fence together, but now the silence between them felt heavier than the work they had done. Clara broke it first. "You never talk much about where you come from," she said, her voice calm but curious. Ethan's gaze flicked toward her before dropping back to the fire. "Not much worth telling," he muttered. She waited, not pushing, just letting the quiet stretch. Finally, he sighed and leaned back. "I used to believe in things. A home, family, even love. But I learned the hard way those things can be taken from you." His tone was flat, but there was an ache underneath it. He told her about a small farm he once owned, how a dishonest partner swindled him out of it, leaving him broke and bitter. He spoke of a woman he had once cared for deeply, who left when times grew hard, choosing comfort over loyalty. Clara listened intently, sensing how deep his scars ran. She realized that beneath his guarded manner was a man who had learned to protect himself by pushing people away. When he finished, she hesitated before sharing her own truth. "I was engaged once," she said softly. "His name was Samuel. We planned a life here, but he died before it could begin." Her voice caught slightly, but she didn't look away from Ethan. "Since then, it's just been me and this land. I thought if I kept working, if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't notice how empty it all feels." The firelight flickered over their faces, casting shadows and softening the sharp edges. There was a quiet understanding in the air, a recognition of shared loss. For the first time, they weren't just a debtor and a collector, but two people carrying wounds the other could see. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, the silence felt warm rather than heavy. Then, in the distance, a faint sound of laughter carried on the night air, not from the ranch, but from town. Clara frowned. "They've been talking, haven't they?" she asked. Ethan nodded slightly. "Small towns always talk, and they've seen us working together, sharing meals." His lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Clara shook her head. "Let them talk. I have more important things to worry about." But Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. For the first time, he began to question the job he had come here to do. And as the fire burned low, neither of them said it aloud, but both knew something between them had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. The afternoon sun hung low over the ranch, its golden light streaking across the dry pastures, but the air was heavy with something far darker than the looming evening. Clara had just finished mending a section of the fence when she saw the dust cloud rising from the dirt road. Her heart sank. She knew it wasn't Ethan. This dust cloud carried a sharper, more dangerous promise. A black, polished carriage rolled into view, drawn by two gleaming horses, and the man who stepped out wore a fine suit that didn't belong in ranch country. His smug smile spread slowly as his gaze swept over the worn barn, the patched fences, and finally her. "Miss Clara," he greeted, his voice smooth but dripping with superiority. "I believe you know why I'm here." It was Mr. Harrow, Ethan's employer, the man who claimed ownership of everything her father had left behind. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his jaw tightening when he saw who had arrived. Harrow wasted no time. "I've been patient, but my patience is gone. You've had long enough. By the end of the week, I want this land cleared. If not—" He let the threat linger, his smile sharpening. Clara's chest burned with a mix of fury and helplessness. She opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan stepped forward. "That wasn't the agreement," Ethan said flatly, his voice like steel. "I told her she had more time." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "You work for me, not for her. You don't make agreements. You enforce mine." The air between them was tense enough to choke on. Clara's eyes flicked between the two men, stunned to hear Ethan speak for her. Harrow crossed his arms, his voice turning to ice. "You've got until tomorrow night. And if you can't do the job, I'll send someone who will. The sheriff, perhaps." I'm sure he'll be more efficient. When Harrow finally drove off, the sound of his carriage wheels faded, but the weight of his words lingered like storm clouds. Clara turned to Ethan, confusion and curiosity swirling in her eyes. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. Ethan avoided her gaze, his jaw working. "Because it's wrong," he muttered. "You deserve more than being tossed out like this." She studied him for a long moment. The guarded, cold man she'd met was changing. His voice carried something new, conviction. She realized he wasn't just stalling anymore. He was fighting for her. That night, the ranch was quieter than usual. The wind had stilled, the crickets subdued, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clara found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring into the darkness. She sat beside him, the creak of the wooden steps loud in the silence. "Why are you really here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "When I came here, all I cared about was getting paid. Take the land. Hand it over, move on. But I've seen how hard you fight, how much this place means to you. I don't want to be the man who takes it from you anymore." Her throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. For the first time in a long while, she felt a fragile spark of hope. But before she could cling to it, his next words came, heavy and grim. "Harrow won't let me walk away from this. If I don't do it, someone else will, and they'll come harder. We have little time." They sat in silence, the night pressing in. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, as if echoing the danger ahead. And in that moment, Clara realized that the battle for her ranch had shifted. It was no longer just her fight. Ethan was in it too, and that made her both stronger and more afraid. The chapter closed with the tension of a ticking clock, Harrow's threat looming. Somewhere in the shadows of the coming days, the sheriff's boots could already be heard. The morning was unervingly still, the kind of quiet that makes you feel something's wrong before you even see it. Clara was in the yard mending a section of fence when the crunch of wagon wheels on the dirt road drew her attention. She looked up to see the sheriff's cart rolling toward the ranch, dust rising behind the horse's hooves. Her stomach tightened. The set of his jaw and the papers in his hand told her all she needed to know before he even spoke. The sheriff dismounted slowly, tipping his hat in a gesture that felt more like an apology than respect. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice low, "I'm here on official business." He unfolded the papers and read the cold, legal words that sliced through her chest. An eviction notice. Clara's heart pounded in her ears. Every word felt like a nail sealing her fate. She stared at the document in his hand, then at the distant figure approaching on horseback. It was Ethan. The realization hit her like a whip. Her face hardened. "You!" she whispered, the word tasting like betrayal. "You brought him here." Ethan pulled up the yard, dismounted, and stepped forward, confusion etched into his face. "What's going on?" he asked, looking from Clara to the sheriff. But she didn't answer. Instead, her glare could have cut glass. "Don't pretend you don't know," she snapped. "You called him, didn't you? Couldn't wait for your week to be up." His brows knit together. "Clara, I didn't." "Save it." She cut him off, her voice trembling between fury and heartbreak. "I let myself believe you were different, that maybe you weren't just another man sent to take what's mine. But I was wrong." The sheriff shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable in the storm of emotions brewing between them. "Miss, I'm just here doing my job," he murmured, but his words were little more than dust in the wind compared to the fire raging in Clara's chest. Ethan took a step toward her, but she backed away, shaking her head. "Get out," she said coldly. "Get out before I say something I can't take back." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes stayed locked on his. For a long moment, Ethan stood there, silent. Then, with his jaw tight and his shoulders stiff, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. Clara stood frozen, watching until he disappeared over the ridge, her breath sharp and uneven. Ethan's ride into town was a blur of dust and gnawing anger. Not at Clara, never at her, but at himself for not protecting her from this. At the employer who had started this whole mess. At the sick feeling that he might have lost something precious before he even had the courage to hold on to it. He headed straight for the saloon, not for a drink, but because he'd seen the employer's accountant hanging around there earlier in the week. The man was a slippery sort, always scribbling in ledgers and whispering to the wrong kind of folks. Ethan caught him at a back table, nursing a cheap whiskey. "Need to talk," Ethan said flatly, slamming his hand down on the table. The man jumped, eyes darting nervously. "Ain't nothing to talk about," he muttered. But Ethan wasn't here to ask politely. It took a few minutes of low, heated words and the subtle but undeniable threat of Ethan's clenched fist before the accountant cracked. From his satchel, he pulled a crumpled set of documents, the original debt papers. They were smudged with ink, the signatures mismatched, and the dates altered. Ethan's stomach turned. This was proof that the entire debt was a fabrication. Proof that Clara's father had never owed that much, if anything at all. The man stammered something about just following orders, but Ethan had already turned away. His mind was made up. He was going to put this right, no matter what it cost him. As he left the saloon, the sun was sinking low, streaking the sky in gold and crimson. For the first time since he'd ridden into Clara's life, Ethan felt something sharp and certain in his chest, a purpose that had nothing to do with money or orders. He tightened his grip on the forged papers. "Hang on, Clara," he murmured to himself. "I'm not letting them take this from you. Not now. Not ever." And with that, he swung into the saddle, heading back toward the ranch with the proof that could change everything. The sun dipped low over the horizon, spilling warm gold across the ranch as Clara stood on the porch, staring at the dusty road that wound into the distance. She was expecting visitors. Certainly not him. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats broke the quiet, and her chest tightened when she saw Ethan riding toward her. His shoulders were squared, his expression grim, but in his eyes there was a spark. Something different from the last time they had spoken. He dismounted without a word, reaching into his saddlebag. "I have something you need to see," he said, voice low. Clara crossed her arms, the memory of the sheriff's arrival still fresh in her mind. "Why should I?" she asked coldly. Ethan stepped closer and held out a stack of weathered papers. "Because this proves everything. The debt papers were forged. Your father didn't owe a dime." His gaze locked with hers. "They've been trying to steal this ranch from you." Clara hesitated, her breath catching. Her fingers brushed the edge of the papers, feeling the weight of them and the truth. She could see the official seals, the mismatched signatures, the dates that didn't line up. It was damning evidence. Still, her pride kept her voice guarded. "Even if that's true, why help me now?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I should have done it from the start. And because I'm not leaving you to fight this alone." The porch fell silent, except for the creak of the boards beneath their boots. Clara studied him, searching for deceit, but found only sincerity and weariness in his face. She gave a slow nod. "All right, we'll fight them." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The next morning, they rode into town together. The street seemed narrower than usual, lined with faces that whispered as they passed. Clara kept her head high, refusing to let the gossipers see her unease. They stopped outside the small, weather-beaten office of the town's lawyer, Mr. Harlan, a man who had once been a close friend of her father's before age and disappointment had turned him reclusive. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight. Mr. Harlan looked up from his desk, his brows knitting. "Clara? Ethan? Didn't expect to see you two together." Ethan stepped forward, laying the papers on the desk. "We need your help. These prove the bank's claim on the ranch is fraudulent." The old man adjusted his spectacles, scanning each page. His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned. They thought they could get away with this." Mr. Harlan leaned back in his chair, a spark of the old fire in his eyes. "Your father was a good man. Clara, I'd be honored to fight for his land." He pulled out a ledger, already drafting legal motions. Clara felt something stir inside her, a cautious hope she hadn't felt in months. Word spread quickly after their visit to the lawyer. Old ranch hands who had worked for her father years ago came by to offer their support. Even a few townsfolk who had turned their backs on her began to whisper encouragement. It wasn't much, but was enough to remind Clara that she wasn't entirely alone. Days passed in a blur of preparation. Witnesses were lined up, documents were gathered, and every evening Clara and Ethan would sit at her kitchen table, going over details by lamplight. They still bicker from time to time, about strategy, about small mistakes, but beneath it all was a growing trust neither could ignore. One night, after a particularly long day, Ethan found Clara outside, leaning against a corral fence. The sky above was a dark velvet, scattered with stars. The cool air carried a faint scent of hay and wood smoke. "Nervous?" he asked quietly. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "More than I'd like to admit." He stepped beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "We'll win," he said simply. For a long moment, they stood there listening to the night. Clara glanced at him, noticing the way the starlight softened his features, making him seem almost boyish. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly the space between them disappeared. Their lips met, tentative at first, then lingering, as though both were afraid to let go. When they finally parted, neither spoke. The moment hung between them, fragile yet unshakable. Clara turned her gaze back to the stars, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Whatever the trial brought, she knew one thing. She wasn't facing alone anymore. The courthouse stood like an old sentinel at the heart of town, its weathered bricks and creaking steps whispering of justice won and lost over the years. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the wooden benches filled with townsfolk who had come to witness the showdown. Clara sat straight-backed, her chin high despite the anxious beating of her heart. Ethan sat beside her, his broad shoulders squared, the set of his jaw betraying the storm inside him. Across the room, the employer lounged with smug confidence, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers and a cluster of men who whispered in his ear. The trial began with the employer's side presenting their case, weaving a tale of overdue debts and broken agreements. Their words were smooth, rehearsed, and dripping with false sincerity. Clara clenched her fists under the table, every lie feeling like a slap to her late father's memory. When the employer's first witness, a ranch hand from years ago, took the stand, it was clear he'd been bought. His eyes darted nervously, but his testimony echoed the employer's claims. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, knowing their turn was coming. When Ethan finally took the stand, the room shifted. He spoke slowly, clearly, every word measured. He laid bare his own role, how he'd been hired to repossess Clara's land, how he'd been told she was nothing but a squatter holding up business. Then he revealed the truth, the forged documents he had discovered, the ledger entries altered to inflate debts that never existed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan knew he was burning bridges. Men like his employer didn't forgive betrayal. But as he met Clara's eyes, he felt the risk was worth it. The employer's lawyers tried to rattle him, pressing about his past as a drifter, hinting at jobs gone wrong. Ethan didn't flinch. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but I know a lie when I see one, and I won't let an honest woman lose her land over it." His voice carried across the room, leaving a silence in its wake that the lawyers couldn't quite fill. Then came Clara's turn. She rose, her dress simple but neat, her hands clasped in front of her as she walked to the witness stand. She spoke not of law, but of legacy, how her father had built the ranch with his own hands, how she fought to keep it alive through droughts, storms, and loss. Her voice wavered only once, when she mentioned her late fiancé, but she steadied herself quickly, locking eyes with the judge. "This land isn't just dirt and fences," she said softly. "It's my family's history, and I won't stand by while someone steals it." The employer's lawyers attempted to pick apart her words, but Clara's quiet strength was unshakable. By the time she stepped down, the crowd had shifted, murmurs of support replacing the earlier whispers of doubt. Even the judge, a stern man known for his impartiality, seemed moved. As the final statement were made, the employer grew restless. He leaned toward one of his witnesses, slipping something small into the man's palm. But the act didn't go unnoticed. A sharp-eyed bailiff intercepted the exchange, and the courtroom erupted in shocked whispers when a folded wad of cash was revealed. The judge's gavel slammed down, his voice booming as he ordered the employer to stand. The verdict came swiftly. The forged documents, the bribery attempt, the false testimony, it all painted a clear picture. "This court finds you guilty of fraud. the judge declared, and orders the immediate return of the ranch to Miss Clara Dawson. Applause broke out in the room, though the judge's gavel tried in vain to quiet it. Clara sat frozen, the weight of months of fear and struggle finally lifting from her shoulders. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable in the chaos. He wanted to say something, anything, but the moment felt fragile, suspended between victory and the unspoken truths still between them. Clara met his gaze, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The crowd surged around them, congratulating her, clapping Ethan on the back, but neither felt the celebration fully. As the employer was led away in cuffs, spitting curses over his shoulder, the courthouse doors opened to the bright, warm sun. Clara stepped outside first, inhaling deeply as if the air had never been sweeter. Ethan lingered behind her, watching her silhouette in the golden light. The ranch was safe. The fight was over. But something else hung in the space between them. Something they would have to face soon, and neither was quite ready for it. The trial had given them justice. What it hadn't given them was clarity about where they stood with each other. That battle was still to come. The soft glow of the evening sun bathed the ranch in golden light, its rays stretching across the rolling fields Clara had fought so hard to keep. She stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the cattle graze peacefully as if the chaos of the past weeks had been nothing more than a bad dream. Yet deep inside, the memories of courtrooms, storms, and bitter arguments lingered, not as pain, but as proof of survival. She had been pushed to the edge and found a strength she never knew she possessed. But one question still haunted her. What would happen to Ethan now? Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his hat in his hands, fidgeting in a way she had never seen before. The man who had once walked into her life as a stranger sent to take everything from her now looked like he was afraid of losing something far more precious. He cleared his throat, glancing up at her with eyes that held both hesitation and certainty. "Clara," he began, voice low, "I've been a lot of things in my life, a drifter, a hired hand, even someone you had every right to hate. But I don't want to be just a chapter in your story." Clara's chest tightened as he stepped closer, the fading light catching the lines of wear and worry on his face. "I want to stay," he said, almost like it was a confession. "But only if you want me here. Not out of gratitude. Not because I helped you in the land. Because you want me." His voice cracked just slightly, and for a moment, she saw the vulnerable man behind the weathered exterior, the one who had been hurt before and was risking himself again. Her throat felt dry, her heart pounding. "Ethan," she started, but before she could finish, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. Inside was a simple silver ring, not polished, not new, but clearly cherished. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's all I have. I thought maybe it could be the start of something. If you'll have me." His eyes locked on hers, as if the entire world hung on her answer. Clara blinked back tears, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She thought of the storms they'd weathered, literal and otherwise, the nights in the barn, the shared meals, the unspoken glances. He wasn't just asking her to marry him. He was asking to build a life together, brick by brick, heart by heart. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "Yes, Ethan, I'll have you, for as long as this ranch stands, and even after." Relief and joy flashed across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He let out a quiet laugh, the kind that came from deep within, before pulling her into his arms. The wind picked up just slightly, carrying the scent of the earth, hay, and the promise of tomorrow. They stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, knowing that their story had begun with a fight for land, but it ended with a finding a home, not in walls or acres, but in each other's hearts. The weeks following the trial brought a quiet, yet undeniable transformation to the ranch. What was once a place weighed down by worry and loneliness now felt alive with movement, laughter, and hope. Clara found herself waking before sunrise not out of dread, but with a smile, eager to meet the day. The land seemed to sense the change, too. The grass grew greener, the fences stood firm, and the livestock thrived. Neighbors who long kept their distance began stopping by again, offering congratulations, a helping hand, and stories about Clara's father's time on the land. Ethan had settled into ranch life as if he had always belonged there. He worked tirelessly beside Clara, whether it was mending fences, herding cattle, or repairing the old barn roof. There was no trace of the hired man who had once arrived with a secret mission. Instead, there was a partner, steady and dependable, who made the work lighter simply by being near. Clara found herself laughing more than she had in years, her laughter often answered by Ethan's warm, low chuckle. The evenings became their favorite time. After the day's labor, they would share supper at the kitchen table, swapping stories, teasing each other about small mistakes, and enjoying the peace of knowing the land was truly theirs. Sometimes, they would saddle the horses and ride out to the western ridge to watch the sunset. The sky would burn gold and crimson, and they would sit side by side, speaking little, content in the quiet bond that had grown between them. Life's simple joys began to fill their days. Clara taught Ethan how to make her father's favorite cornbread, laughing as he got flour on his shirt. Ethan showed Clara a quicker way to fix a broken gate latch, though she insisted her way was the proper ranch method. They discovered that working side by side brought its own kind of intimacy, a closeness built not just on words, but on shared effort, mutual respect, and small, everyday gestures of care. As spring warmed, the air and the fields turned lush, preparations for their wedding began. They chose to keep it small, just a handful of friends, neighbors, and the minister who had known Clara since she was a girl. The barn would be cleared and strung with lanterns, the tables set with simple flowers from the fields. There was no need for grandeur. The beauty of the ranch and the life they had built together was more than enough. One afternoon, as Clara and Ethan walked back from checking the southern pasture, he took her hand without a word. The ranch stretched out before them, bathed in the golden light of late day, and Clara felt a deep, quiet certainty settle in her heart. They had endured storms, both in the skies and in their lives, and had come through stronger. Together, whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it side by side. And for the first time in years, the ranch wasn't just her responsibility. It was their home. The morning of their wedding dawned soft and golden, the kind of day that felt blessed from the start. Clara stood by her bedroom window, watching the sun climb over the hills, the light spilling across the ranch she had fought so hard to keep. Below, she could see neighbors arriving, their wagons and horses carrying baskets of food, flowers, and the warm energy of celebration. The barn, once a place of dust and silence, had been transformed overnight into a space alive with the scent of fresh hay and wildflowers, lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan was already outside, his hands busy but his face lit with a smile she had never seen in their earliest days together. He spoke with old Mr. Jenkins about the ceremony, shook hands with townsfolk, and even managed to get teased by the Blackwell sisters for how handsome he looked in his new vest. Clara felt a swell of affection that almost brought tears to her eyes. This man had walked into her life under complicated circumstances, but somehow he had become the very foundation of her happiness. The ceremony took place under the open sky, at the edge of the western pasture, where the land rolled gently toward the horizon. They stood beneath a simple arch draped in wildflowers, with the minister smiling at them like a father proud of his own children. The small group of friends and neighbors formed a half-circle, their faces warm with genuine joy. Clara's voice trembled slightly as she spoke her vows, promising to walk beside Ethan in sunshine and storm alike. Ethan's deep voice carried over the breeze as he vowed to protect her heart, her home, and the life they were building together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer rose from the guests, and Clara felt laughter bubble out of her. Ethan pulled her close and kissed her, the kind of kiss that sealed not just a promise, but future. Around them, people clapped, some wiping away tears, and the sound of fiddles and guitar strings began to fill the air as the small celebration turned to music and dancing. They spent the afternoon sharing food, stories, and laughter. Clara danced barefoot in the grass with children from the neighboring farms, her dress swirling in the wind. Ethan found himself deep in conversation with some of the older ranchers, who offered advice, ribbing, and the occasional story about her father that made Clara's heart ache in the best way. The hours slipped away until the light began to turn golden again, the sky painting itself in colors too beautiful to describe. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Ethan found Clara by the barn door. Without a word, he offered his hand, and she took it. The two of them saddled their horses, the guests watching with knowing smiles, and rode out toward the western ridge. The air was warm, filled with the scent of grass and dust, and the sound of the horses' hooves matched the steady rhythm of their hearts. They reached the ridge just as the sun began its slow descent. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sky awash in gold, pink, and deepening blue. Ethan reached across and took Clara's hand, their horses walking side by side. Neither spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. Everything they had endured, everything they had built, was here in this moment. Clara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the sunset, and smiled. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, steady and sure. In the quiet of the fading day, with the land spread out before them and the promise of a shared future in their hearts, the truth was undeniable. He came to take everything, but gave her more than she'd ever dreamed.